The gavel came down so hard it cracked the edge of the table, and every soul packed inside Ridrock's town hall went utterly silent. Isaac Elroy stood in the center of the room like a man carved from the red earth itself, his jaw set, his dark eyes burning with something that went far beyond ordinary anger. He had ridden hard through the night to get here, and the dust was still on his boots, still on the brim of his hat, which he held in his left hand while his right pointed directly at Harlan Voss, president of the Consolidated Territorial Bank, who sat behind a folding table at the front of the room surrounded by documents, ledgers, and two men in city suits who looked like they had never seen a real day of weather in their lives. "You will not touch that land," Isaac said, his voice low but carrying every inch of the packed hall. "Her land is not for sale." Harlan Voss leaned back in his chair and spread his hands the way men do when they want to appear reasonable while being anything but. He was 52, gone soft around the middle, with gray sideburns and eyes the color of old pewter that missed nothing and gave away even less. "Mr. Elroy," he said, with the patient tone of a man explaining arithmetic to someone slow, "the foreclosure proceedings are perfectly legal. I have the documentation right here. Miss Danielle Dre defaulted on her father's loan. The note came due 60 days ago, and the bank holds the deed as collateral. This is a business matter, not a personal one." "Everything about this is personal," Isaac said, taking one step forward, and the crowd seemed to press itself backward by instinct. "You waited until her father was 3 weeks in the ground. You sent your notice on a Sunday when the post office was closed so she couldn't wire her attorney. And now you're trying to auction a 4,000-acre cattle ranch in front of a room full of men you've already made arrangements with." He scanned the room, his gaze landing on faces that had the decency to look away. "I know what kind of auction this is." Harlan's expression tightened. "Just slightly. If you have allegations of impropriety, Mr. Elroy, you are welcome to bring them before a court." "I'm bringing them before these people right now," Isaac said, and then he turned to face the crowd and something in his bearing shifted, opened up, became something raw and urgent and honest. "Every man in this room knows what Harlan Voss does. He waits for grief to weaken people. He waits for drought, for death, for disaster. He lets good people fall behind and then he takes what they built with their whole lives. Josephine Dre's grandfather broke that land with his hands. Her father nearly died defending it. And Harlan Voss wants to turn it into a cattle consortium for investors in Kansas City who have never set foot in this territory." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. 3 months earlier, Isaac Elroy had not even known Josephine Dre's name. He had come to Red Rock, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1882, from a cattle operation in the Texas Panhandle that he had built himself from almost nothing, starting at 16 as a hand on someone else's ranch and working every year since with a purpose so singular. It had cost him 2 friendships, 1 engagement, and more sleep than he could ever count back. He was 31 now, broad-shouldered, quieter than people expected, with a reputation in the cattle trade that preceded him like a weather front. He was known for being fair to his hands, brutal in negotiation, and absolutely unwilling to compromise on what he believed was right, which had made him wealthy in the ways that mattered and difficult in the ways that made people uncomfortable. He had come to Red Rock looking to lease summer grazing rights along the eastern ridge of the territory, where the grass ran long and thick through June and July, and the water from the Sanger Creek made it ideal for fattening cattle before the fall drives. He had heard there was a rancher named Dre who held the eastern parcels, and who might be willing to negotiate a seasonal arrangement. What no one had told him, because he had not asked the right people, was that Thomas Dre had died of a fever 6 weeks before Isaac arrived, and that the ranch was now being managed by his daughter. The morning Isaac Elroy rode up the long dry road toward the Dre ranch house, he saw someone on the roof. It was not what he expected. It was a woman, maybe 24 or 25, wearing a plain work dress with her dark hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat, crouched over the northwest corner of the roof with a hammer in her hand, replacing shingles with the focused, efficient movements of someone who had been doing this kind of work all her life. There was a boy of about 14 on the ground handing materials up a ladder, and from the way they spoke to each other, short and easy and comfortable, it was clear they worked together often. Isaac reined his horse to a stop at the fence gate and called up, "I'm looking for Thomas Dre." The woman looked down at him without stopping her work. "He passed in March," she said. "I'm his daughter. What do you need?" He had not expected that either. Not the directness of it, not the calm way she said it, as though she had already made her peace with the loss and was not interested in anyone's sympathy, or perhaps simply could not afford it. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, because it was true and because he was that kind of man. She set down the hammer for a moment and looked at him properly. "Thank you," she said, and the two words had an entire private grief behind them that she did not invite him to explore. "Who are you?" "Isaac Elroy, out of Amarillo. I run cattle. I was hoping to speak with your father about grazing rights on the eastern ridge." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with an assessment so direct and unguarded that it made him straighten slightly in the saddle, though he could not have said why. "Come back tomorrow morning," she said. "I'll have looked over my father's arrangements by then, and I'll know what I can offer." He came back the next morning, and she was already at the kitchen table with a map and her father's ledger when he came to the door. She offered him coffee, which was strong and black and better than anything he had made for himself in months. She laid out the terms she was willing to consider, calmly and clearly, and she asked 3 questions about his operation that surprised him with their precision. She had clearly been managing the actual work of this ranch for years before her father's death, maybe her whole adult life, and she knew what the land was worth and what she needed from it, and she was not going to be talked into something that did not serve her. He agreed to her terms, which were fair. He should have left it at that. He did not leave it at that. He found reasons to return. He told himself it was because of the grazing arrangement, because there were logistics to discuss, water access points to agree on, gates to be checked. Some of this was true. But the honest reason, the one he pushed to the back of his mind the way a man pushes a splinter deeper into his palm because pulling it out hurts more, was Josephine Dre herself. She was not like the women he had known, and he had known enough women to understand that comparison was the wrong frame entirely. She was simply herself, completely. She laughed rarely but genuinely, and when she laughed, it changed the whole shape of her face. She read books and left them open face down on the porch railing, and when he mentioned once that he had read the same book years ago, she asked him what he thought of it with a seriousness that turned the next 2 hours into the best conversation he had had in years. She was capable of silence that was comfortable rather than tense, which was rarer than most people understood. She was fiercely, quietly proud, and she carried the weight of her grief and her financial worry and the 100 daily demands of running a working ranch with a steadiness that he found himself watching with something close to reverence. He had been in love before. He knew what the early stages felt like, the heightened attention, the way a person's name started taking up more space in your thoughts than was reasonable. He had been engaged once, to a woman in Amarillo named Clara who had eventually married a merchant and was probably happier for it. And he did not think about Clara anymore and had not for a long time. What he felt beginning to take shape around Josephine Dre was different in character and weight from anything he had felt before, and it frightened him somewhat, which he considered an honest and appropriate response. What he did not know for the first several weeks was the full shape of the trouble she was in. He learned it by degrees. First, in a conversation with the blacksmith in town, who mentioned casually that Dre's note at the Consolidated was coming due, and that people were wondering how the daughter would manage. "How much time do you have?" he asked. She looked at the horizon, which was turning all those colors it turned in the evenings out here, the deep orange and the purple and the something else that had no real name. 60 days, she said. Maybe a little more if I can talk to Harlan Voss directly and he agrees to an extension. Will he? She did not answer right away, and the way she did not answer told him everything. He had heard Harlan Voss's name before he came to Red Rock. In the cattle trade, there were bankers you could work with and bankers who were predators, and the distinction was important, and Harlan Voss's name came up in the second category. He was not a simple villain. He operated within the law mostly, and he was clever enough to arrange things so that his more ruthless maneuvers looked like ordinary business. But there were patterns that men in the trade recognized, and Voss had patterns. He lent to families who were one bad season from desperate. He set terms that were just manageable enough that borrowers signed. He waited. He collected. The Dre Ranch was exactly his kind of target. 4,000 acres of prime New Mexico territory, water rights, established grazing, a house and outbuildings in good repair, and a sole heir who was a woman in a territory where women had no legal status to challenge a bank proceeding in their own name without considerable difficulty. He would foreclose, sell to one of the investment consortiums he had arrangements with back east, take his commission, and Josephine Dre would have nothing. Isaac spent 3 nights turning it over in his mind before he said anything to her. On the 4th day, he rode into town and went to see Samuel Greer, who was Red Rock's only attorney, a thin, dry-voiced man of about 50 who kept his office above the general store, and who was known to be honest if not particularly aggressive. He asked Samuel what legal options existed for contesting a foreclosure on a note that had been set at terms the borrower may not have fully understood. Samuel told him the truth, which was that the options were limited. A court challenge would take months and cost money that Josephine did not have, and even then the odds were not good if Voss's paperwork was in order, and Voss's paperwork was always in order. The only real options were to find the capital to pay the note, find a legal irregularity in the loan documents, or find some other leverage. What kind of other leverage? Isaac asked. Samuel looked at him for a long moment. You're asking me as a man who has an interest in the Dre property, he said. It was not a question. I'm asking you as someone who doesn't like watching a man like Harlan Voss do what he does, Isaac said. Samuel nodded slowly and told him to come back in a week. He was going to need time to look at the loan documents, which he would need Josephine to authorize him to access. Isaac went to Josephine and told her everything. He told her what he had heard about Voss, what Samuel had said, what the situation looked like from the outside. He was careful to present it plainly, without softening it so much that she didn't understand the danger, and without making it so stark that he seemed to be trying to frighten her into something. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about her that undid him consistently, that absolute quality of her attention. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I know all of this. I thought you might, he said. What I don't know, she said, is why you're telling me. You have a seasonal grazing arrangement with me. If I lose the land, your agreement becomes someone else's problem. You could walk away. He looked at her. The afternoon light was coming through the window over the kitchen sink, and it caught the side of her face and her hair, and he wanted very much to say something that he was not ready to say. "I could," he said. "I'm not going to." She studied him for a long moment with those steady, dark eyes. "Why not?" "Because it's the wrong thing," he said, "and because I don't want to." She held his gaze for 3 seconds, maybe 4, and then she looked down at the table. "All right," she said quietly. "Let's see what Samuel finds." What Samuel found, over the next week and a half, was both better and worse than they had hoped. Better because there was in fact an irregularity in the loan documents, a clause about interest compounding that had not been clearly disclosed to Thomas Dre at signing, and which was arguably in violation of territory lending law. Worse because Samuel's assessment was that arguing this clause in court would take months, and the outcome was uncertain and cost money. And also because Harlan Voss clearly anticipated some kind of challenge and was moving faster than the 60-day window suggested he needed to. Voss had filed for an expedited foreclosure hearing. He had scheduled a public auction of the Dre property for the following month, in the town hall, which was technically within the bounds of territorial law, but was being done with a speed that suggested he knew someone might contest it and wanted the sale complete before they could. It was this auction that Isaac Elroy had ridden through the night to interrupt. But before that night, before the confrontation in the town hall, there had been other nights and other mornings, and a slow accumulation of time spent in close proximity to Josephine Dre that had changed him in ways he had not entirely caught up with yet. There had been an evening in early May, 3 weeks into the grazing arrangement, when he had been riding the eastern fence line, and a storm came up faster than he expected, one of the sudden violent ones that this territory produced with no warning, and he had made it to the Dre ranch house just as the sky broke open. She had let him in, and they had sat in the main room while the storm came down and the light flickered, and she had read aloud from the book she was in the middle of, not self-consciously or with any performance in it, just naturally, because it was something to do, and the sound of her voice and the rain and the warmth of the room had created a kind of stillness inside him that he had not felt in years. There had been Sunday afternoon when she asked him if he would stay for supper, and he did, and afterwards they sat on the porch until the stars came out, and she told him about her father, the real version, not the polished grief story version, but the complicated one, the man who had been difficult and proud and loving and sometimes wrong, and who had made choices that had put her in this position, but who had also given her everything she knew about the land and herself. And Isaac had told her about his own father, who had died when Isaac was 14, and about the years working other men's ranches before he had enough to start his own, and about what it cost to build something from nothing and what it felt like when it was finally yours. They did not touch each other. They were careful with each other the way people are careful when they have both been disappointed before and are not sure yet whether to trust what they feel. But something was building between them, slow and genuine and undeniable, and they both knew it, and neither of them said anything about it because the situation was too complicated, and the timing was all wrong, and also because sometimes the most important things move at their own pace. Then the foreclosure notice arrived, and Isaac heard about the auction date, and he rode through the night, and he stood in the center of the town hall and pointed at Harlan Voss, and said the words he meant with his whole chest: "Her land is not for sale." The silence after his speech held for 5 long seconds. Then Harlan Voss cleared his throat and set his hands flat on the table in front of him. "Mr. Elroy," he said, "your passion is noted, but passion is not a legal argument. Unless you have something more substantial to offer this proceeding, I suggest you take a seat or leave the room." "I have something more substantial," Isaac said. He reached into his coat and drew out an envelope and set it on the table in front of Voss, not gently. That is a bank draft from the First National of Santa Fe for the full amount of the outstanding Dre note plus 30 days of additional interest. It was wired to me this morning. The room erupted. Harlan Voss stared at the envelope. The gray of his eyes went hard and flat. You have no legal standing to pay another party's debt, he said, but there was a crack in his voice that had not been there before. Samuel, Isaac said, and Samuel Greer stepped forward from his position near the back wall where he had been standing quietly this whole time. Under territorial law, a third party may satisfy a debt obligation on behalf of a borrower, provided the borrower has issued written consent and the payment is made in full, Samuel said, in his dry, steady voice. I have Miss Dre's signed authorization here, witnessed by 2 parties. The payment is in full. You are legally required to accept it and dismiss this proceeding. Harlan Voss looked at the envelope and at Samuel's documents for a very long time. The men in the city suits beside him leaned in and whispered to him, and he listened, and something moved across his face that was not quite emotion but was close to it, something between fury and the professional recognition of defeat. This isn't finished, he said quietly to Isaac. For today it is, Isaac said. The room breathed out all at once. Josephine was not in the town hall. She was at her ranch, because Isaac had told her the night before not to come, and she had argued with him about it. And he had said that she did not need to be in that room to watch men argue over what was already hers, that she had already done the hard part, and that he would handle the morning. She had looked at him for a long moment with the particular expression she had when she was weighing whether to be angry with him, and decided the argument wasn't worth having right now. And she had said, "You had better come back and tell me exactly what happened," and he had said, "I will," and ridden out before dawn. He came back to the ranch at 10 in the morning with Samuel beside him. The settlement documents were signed by noon. "How much did you pay?" she said. He told her the number. She was quiet again. "That's not a small amount," she said. "No," he agreed. "I don't know when I could pay you back," she said. "It would take years." "I know," he said. She looked at him with those eyes that missed nothing and gave nothing away until they gave away everything. "Why did you do this, Isaac?" The room was very still. Samuel had stepped outside with great professional tact. The afternoon was bright and clear through the windows, and outside the ranch was quiet and ordinary and permanent in a way that made the moment feel both very large and very small. "Because I couldn't let him take it from you," Isaac said. "And because I couldn't watch you lose something your family built and not do what I could to stop it, and because," he stopped, started again. "Because when I ride up that road to this place, I feel something I don't feel anywhere else, and most of that is because of you." Josephine looked at him for a very long moment. Her hands were flat on the table. "That's the most words I've heard you say at once," she said, and there was something warm beneath the dryness of it. "I have strong feelings about a few things," he said. "Apparently," she said. And then, more quietly, "I feel it too, whatever it is. I want you to know that." He held very still, the way a man holds still when something he has been hoping for arrives and he doesn't want to break it. "All right," he said. "Don't make it more complicated than it is right now," she said. "We can make it complicated later. Right now, I just want you to know." "All right," he said again. And this time he smiled, and she looked at the smile and looked away, and there was a color in her face that had not been there before. Harlan Voss did not accept defeat simply. This was something Isaac had anticipated, and it turned out he was right to. 2 weeks after the town hall confrontation, a rider came to the Dre Ranch with a message from a man in Santa Fe claiming to represent an investment group, interested in purchasing grazing rights on the eastern parcels. The offer was generous on its surface, but the structure of it was a trap, a short-term payment that would lock Josephine into an arrangement that would effectively give the group operational control of the land, while she retained the deed on paper. It had Voss's fingerprints all over it. Isaac was at the ranch when the rider arrived. He and Josephine read the offer together, and he watched her face while she read, watched her work through it, watched the moment she saw it for what it was. "He doesn't stop," she said. "No," Isaac said. "He'll try different approaches. He wants this land." "Why?" she said. "There's other land. Why this specific ranch?" It was a good question, and it deserved a real answer. Isaac had been thinking about it too. He had asked around in the weeks since the town hall, talked to cattlemen and merchants and the man at the land office, and what he had pieced together was this. The eastern ridge of the Dre property sat directly over a proposed route for a new rail spur that the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway was quietly planning. Whoever owned those parcels would have enormous leverage over the routing of the line, and the people who knew about it and had positioned themselves to benefit were a very small group that included Harlan Voss. He told Josephine all of this. She was quiet for a moment. "My father didn't know about the railroad," she said. "Almost certainly not," Isaac said. "Voss knew. That's why he lent the money 5 years ago. He was planting a trap he intended to collect on when the time was right." The anger that crossed her face was clean and sharp and deserved. "He preyed on my father's desperation," she said. "On purpose. From the beginning." "Yes," Isaac said. "I believe so." She stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the land for a long moment. Then she turned back and her expression was resolved. "Then we need to do something about that," she said. "Not just defend the land. We need to make sure he can't do this to us or anyone else." This was the thing about Josephine Dre that he had come to understand better as the weeks passed. Her sense of justice was not passive. She did not simply want to be left alone. She wanted the wrong made right, and not just for herself. He found this about her both admirable and characteristic of a kind of moral courage that was more common in people who had watched injustice up close than in people who had only read about it. They went back to Samuel, and this time with a different purpose. They wanted to know whether Voss's knowledge of the railroad route and his use of that knowledge to engineer the loan and subsequent foreclosure constituted fraud. Samuel went very still when they laid it out. He asked them to give him all of what they knew and come back in 4 days. In those 4 days, something shifted between Isaac and Josephine, slowly and naturally. The way things shift in the early summer when warmth comes back gradually, and then all at once. He was spending most of each day at the ranch now, not always working, sometimes simply being there while she managed the 100 things she managed, and she had stopped explaining his presence to anyone who came by, which was a kind of statement. He helped where he could, not taking over, not assuming, but filling in where filling in was useful. He was good at working beside someone and letting them lead. She noticed this. One evening he was mending fence in the south pasture as the sun went down, and she brought him coffee and sat on a fence post nearby, and they talked about nothing in particular for a while. And then she said, "Do you miss Texas?" "Sometimes," he said. "The people I knew there, some of the land." "Do you have family there?" "A sister," he said. "She married a farmer near Lubbock. We write sometimes." She was quiet. "I have a cousin in Colorado," she said. "She's the only family I have left now." The word left was simple and enormous. He put down the wire tool and looked at her. "What happened to your mother?" "Fever," she said. "When I was 11. After that it was just my father and me." She paused. "He was not a demonstrative man, but he taught me everything." He treated me like I was capable of anything he could do, which not every father does, especially with a daughter. I think that was his version of love. Isaac thought about that. Sounds right, he said. My father was the same kind. She looked at him, and something passed between them that was both recognition and something warmer. She reached over and touched his hand, just briefly, just the lightest pressure of her fingers, and then she took her hand back and looked out at the pasture. He felt it long after the touch was gone. Samuel came back with news that was better than they had expected. He had spoken quietly to a man he knew at the land office in Santa Fe, who confirmed the railroad route, and also confirmed that Harlan Voss had been acting as a silent agent for the railroad consortium, which meant his loans to landowners along the proposed route were not simply predatory banking but active real estate manipulation on behalf of a corporate interest that he had never disclosed to borrowers. This was fraud, not small fraud, the kind that would attract the attention of the territorial governor's office if presented correctly. "Will you take this forward?" Isaac asked. Samuel said he would need a formal complaint, documentation, and testimonies from other landowners who had been similarly treated by Voss. This was going to take time and effort. "How many other families?" Josephine asked. Samuel consulted his notes. "I've identified at least 4 others along the proposed route who have had loans with Voss under similar circumstances. 2 of them have already lost their land. 2 are still fighting." Josephine looked at Isaac. He looked back. They did not need to discuss it. They spent the next 3 weeks riding out to meet with the other families. It was not easy work. People who had been burned by one set of powerful interests were not quick to trust anyone new, and Isaac and Josephine were both, in different ways, still strangers in this territory. But Josephine knew how to sit with people, knew how to listen without making them feel exposed, knew how to explain what had happened to her in a way that made room for them to recognize their own story in it. And Isaac knew how to be steady and practical and specific, how to explain what Samuel needed and what it might lead to, and what the risks were honestly without overpromising. Riding back from the second family's place, a homestead 40 miles east run by a widow named Martha Kane, who had already lost 60 of her best acres, Josephine was quiet for a long time. Isaac let her be. He had learned this about her, that she processed things internally, and that silence from him was sometimes the most supportive thing he could offer. "She should never have had to lose those acres," Josephine said finally. "No," Isaac said. "He took them from her the same way he tried to take mine," she said. "Same timing, same pressure, same false urgency. He's done this many times." "He has," Isaac said. "And he's been able to because nobody had the information to see the pattern until now. You changed that." She looked at him. "You changed it," she said. "You came into that town hall and said things that nobody was supposed to say out loud." "I was angry," he said. "You were right," she said. She looked at him for a moment longer than usual. "I am glad you came to Red Rock, Isaac Elroy." He felt the words settle in him like something coming home. "So am I," he said. They rode the rest of the way back in a silence that was warm and full of things not yet said. By the end of July, Samuel had 4 signed testimonies and enough documentation to file a formal complaint with the territorial attorney general. Isaac made a trip to Santa Fe personally to ensure the filing went to the right office and was not intercepted or misplaced, which were real risks when powerful money was involved. He knew a man in Santa Fe, a former cattle association officer who now worked in territorial administration, and who was known to be genuinely honest. And this man took the complaint seriously and personally ensured it reached the Attorney General's desk. The investigation that followed took months, but it was real. By October, Harlan Voss had been formally served with a notice of legal proceeding. By November, the Consolidated Territorial Bank had been placed under a regulatory audit. By January of 1883, two of Voss's outside investors had quietly settled with the two families who had lost land, and Voss himself was facing a formal fraud charge. He never saw the inside of a territorial prison. Men like Voss rarely did. But he was ruined professionally. The bank was restructured under new management, and the railroad consortium paid compensation to every family along the proposed route who had been manipulated. It was not perfect justice, but it was real and measurable, and it mattered. Through all of this, Isaac and Josephine had been building something. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the ordinary accumulated way that real things are built, morning by morning and evening by evening, each honest conversation adding to the foundation. In late September, when the legal proceedings were still unresolved, and the days were shorter, and the light on the land was that particular golden quality of autumn in the high desert, Isaac came to the ranch on a Sunday with no stated purpose for the first time. He had always had an official reason before. Today, he simply rode up the road and tied his horse at the gate and came to the porch where Josephine was sitting with her book, and she looked up at him without surprise. "No fence to mend today," she said. "No fence," he said. He came up to the porch and stood there a moment, hat in hand, and then he said what he had been working toward for months. "Josephine, I need to tell you something plainly." She put the book down. She looked at him. "All right," she said. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been for some time. I haven't said it before because the timing was always complicated, and I didn't want to add anything to what you were already carrying. But I don't want to wait anymore because the waiting has become its own kind of dishonesty, and you deserve to know the truth of how I feel." The afternoon was very still around them. A hawk was circling over the south pasture. Josephine was quiet for a moment. Then she stood up and she came to him, and she looked up at him from close, and there was something in her face that was both old and new, both terrifying and certain. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while." She reached up and put her hand against his face, and he covered it with his own hand, and she said, "I love you too. I don't say things I don't mean." "I know you don't," he said. "Then you know I mean this," she said. He kissed her then, for the first time, standing on the porch of the ranch her grandfather had built, in the autumn light of the New Mexico territory, with the hawk still circling overhead. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was a quiet, honest, certain one, the kind that doesn't need to announce anything because it already knows it's arrived somewhere real. When they stepped back from each other, she was looking at him with those eyes that saw everything. "That took you long enough," she said. "I'm a methodical man," he said. "You are," she said, and she smiled, the full one, the real one, and it was, as it always was, the best thing in the room. The weeks after that were different in the way that everything is different when love is no longer a private secret you are keeping even from yourself. They were easier with each other, more open, more openly tender in the small ways. He would arrive, and she would already have coffee ready without it needing to be discussed. She would bring him out to look at something on the land, a new calf, a section of the creek bank that had shifted, a hawk's nest she had found in the cottonwood trees, and explain it to him with the same unself-conscious pleasure of someone sharing what they love with someone they trust. He listened to everything and remembered all of it, and she noticed. He was not given to large, romantic gestures. He did not bring elaborate gifts or make speeches. His way was different. One evening he arrived after a long day of his own cattle work, and she was fighting with a seized pump mechanism at the water trough. frustrated and dirt-covered and doing her level best not to show how tired she was. And he came straight over without being asked and worked beside her for an hour until the pump was freed. And when it was done, he got her a clean rag and a ladle of water from the working pump without comment. And that was more than any speech would have been. He told her stories in the evenings. He was quieter than most men, but he had a gift for a well-told story, and she would listen with her chin in her hand and her eyes bright. And sometimes she would catch his eye in the middle of the story, and he would lose the thread for a moment because the look in her eyes did something to his ability to think. She played the piano. He discovered this in November, coming to the house and hearing music from inside before she knew he had arrived. She played well and with feeling, not showily, the way she did everything. When he came in and she saw him, she stopped, and he said, "Don't stop." And she played 3 more pieces while he sat in the chair by the fire, and it was one of the best hours he had ever spent. He told her so afterward. She looked at him. "Nobody has said that to me before," she said. "Then they weren't paying enough attention," he said. She reached over and took his hand and held it, just that, just held it, and he felt it with everything he had. Christmas 1882 came quietly. He did not have family nearby, and her cousin could not make the journey from Colorado. And so it was the 2 of them, and the small crew of ranch hands who stayed on through the winter months. A man named Devereaux who had worked for her father for 12 years, and who had decided opinions about everything, and a younger hand named Pete who was 17 and eager and perpetually breaking things accidentally. They had a simple Christmas dinner that Josephine cooked, and that Isaac helped with, somewhat, and they sat at the table together. And Devereaux told stories about the old days on the ranch, and Pete ate enough for 3 men, and everyone laughed more than usual. After dinner, after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, Isaac and Josephine sat together by the fire, and he reached into his coat and brought out a small package, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a piece of string, and set it on the table between them. She looked at it and then at him. "I didn't have anything to give you," she said. "You don't need to give me anything," he said. "Open it." She opened it. Inside was a book she had mentioned once, weeks ago in passing, a book she had read as a girl and had been unable to find a copy of since her father's house had been cleared. He had tracked it down through a bookseller in Santa Fe. She held it in her hands and looked at it for a long moment. "How did you remember that?" she said. "I remember everything you tell me," he said. She looked up at him, and for the second time in his experience of her, her eyes filled. Not fully, not overflowing, but enough to be visible. "Isaac," she said, and it was just his name, but it contained everything. He reached over and took her hand again, and she held on, and the fire burned low, and the night was cold outside, and inside it was warm, and neither of them needed to say anything more for a long time. He proposed in January of 1883, in the most prosaic possible setting, which was the kitchen on a Tuesday morning when they were both drinking coffee and looking over a set of fence replacement estimates for the spring, which was exactly the kind of thing that made him sure he was doing it right. "Josephine," he said, putting down his coffee cup. She said, still looking at the estimates. "Look at me," he said. She looked up, and something in his expression made her go still. "I want to marry you," he said, "if you'll have me. I want to be here on this land with you for the rest of my life. I want to help you build what you're building and have you know that I'm not going anywhere. That's what I want." He paused. "I realize I didn't bring a ring. I thought about it, and then I thought that you would probably prefer to choose your own ring, which I will absolutely pay for, whatever you want." She was looking at him with that expression that he would never fully decode, but that always made him feel seen down to the depths. She was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," she said, "I'll have you." She reached across the table and took his hand. "And you're right that I want to choose my own ring." He laughed properly, freely, the way he rarely laughed. And she laughed with him. And the kitchen was warm and the morning was bright. And the future was as open and alive as the land outside the window. They were married in March 1883, in Red Rock, in the small whitewashed church on Main Street that had a leaky roof they had patched together the previous autumn as part of a community repair day. Samuel Greer stood up for Isaac. Josephine's cousin Margaret came down from Colorado for it. A bright, red-haired woman of 30 who wept openly throughout the ceremony and kissed Isaac firmly on the cheek afterward, and told him that Josephine was the finest person she knew and he had better understand that. He told her he already did. The ceremony was simple. The vows were the traditional ones, but when Isaac said them, he said them with the quiet, absolute certainty that was his particular character. And Josephine, who said everything she meant and only what she meant, said them back. And there was not a single person in that small church who didn't understand that these two people were entirely serious about what they were doing. The reception afterward was at the ranch, because the ranch was where everything true about them had happened. Devereaux, who turned out to have unsuspected talents, played the fiddle with Pete and two other hands while people danced on the cleared flat ground near the house in the March sunshine. People from town came, people they had not expected, neighbors from surrounding ranches, even a few people from outside Red Rock who had heard about the town hall confrontation and the legal case and wanted to meet the woman who had held her land and the man who had stood up for her. Martha Kane came, the widow from East who had lost her 60 acres and was now in the process of recovering part of them through the compensation proceedings. She shook Isaac's hand and held Josephine's for a moment and said only, "Thank you," in a voice that held the full weight of what she meant. Josephine nodded and held her hand back, and the two women understood each other completely in that moment. The sun went down over the land and the party continued, and Isaac stood for a moment apart from it, watching Josephine in conversation with her cousin, her hands moving when she talked, her face alive and open in the way it was only when she was with people she trusted. And the word wife was doing something entirely new in his mind, pressing against the shape of it, finding it both impossible and entirely right. She caught his eye across the yard, and he saw her recognize what he was feeling, and she smiled at him, the full smile, the real one, and went back to her conversation. And he thought that he would never stop being grateful for the road that had brought him up to this ranch and to her. The first year of their marriage was full and hard and good. Isaac integrated his cattle operation with hers, which required more negotiation than either of them had expected, even though they both knew how each other worked. They disagreed, sometimes sharply, about how to handle certain business matters and how to structure the grazing rotation, and how to deal with a difficult hand, who Josephine wanted to keep and Isaac thought they should let go. They were both people who had strong opinions and were used to making their own decisions, and learning to make decisions together without one of them simply defaulting to the other was real work. But they had the capacity for honest argument, which not every couple has, and they had the sense to separate the work disagreements from the personal ones. And they had something underneath all of it that held, which was the real trust that had been built over all those months before they ever kissed on the porch. Isaac had a particular habit of going quiet when he was troubled, of pulling inward, and Josephine had had to learn not to interpret this as rejection, but as his particular way of processing things, and to ask directly when something seemed wrong rather than waiting for him to volunteer it. He had learned that she occasionally needed time alone, not from him specifically but from the accumulated demands of everything and everyone. and that when she went out on her own to ride the east pasture fence line in the afternoon. This was not a statement about their marriage, but a necessary solitude that made her better company afterward. These were not dramatic discoveries. They were the ordinary learning that happens when two people decide to share a life. In June of 1884, Josephine told him she was expecting a child. She told him on a Sunday morning, matter-of-factly, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, handing him the news the way she handed him everything, clearly and directly. She was watching his face carefully. He set his coffee cup down. "When?" he said. "December," she said. "Near as I can work it out." He looked at her for a moment, and then he got up and came around the table and crouched beside her chair and took her face in his hands and looked at her very carefully. "Are you all right?" he said. "Are you happy about this?" She put her hands over his. "Yes," she said, "and yes, are you?" "More than I know how to say," he said. She put her forehead against his. "Then that's decided," she said. He laughed softly, this man who laughed rarely, and kissed her gently, and then he sat back on his heels and looked at her with something so open in his face that she caught her breath a little. "A December child," she said. "We'll need to get the nursery room ready." "We'll start this week," he said. The nursery had been her father's small library room, and clearing it out was not without emotion for her. But she made it matter of fact, keeping the books she wanted and donating the rest to the school that Red Rock had recently established with funds partly raised by Josephine herself, and a committee of townswomen who had decided their children deserved formal education. The room became warm and plain and ready. In December of 1884, their son was born. They named him Thomas, for her father, with the middle name James for his father. He was born in a difficult labor, long and exhausting, with the doctor from Red Rock in attendance and Josephine's cousin Margaret having come down from Colorado again. And at the end of it, Josephine was pale and wrung out and utterly herself about it, not complaining, simply enduring until it was done. And when the baby was put in her arms, she looked at him with an expression that Isaac had never seen on her face before, something beyond words in any language. He sat beside her bed and held her hand while she held the baby, and he was not a man who cried easily, but his throat was very tight and he did not try to speak for a while. "He looks like you," Josephine said, studying the baby's face with her usual analytical attention. "Every father's nightmare," Isaac said. She laughed, exhausted and genuine, and the baby startled at the sound and then settled again, and Isaac looked at the two of them and felt something that had no name, but that was the most complete thing he had ever felt. Thomas Elroy grew into a serious, curious boy who had his father's quietness and his mother's precision, and who was, at age 3, already showing a particular interest in the workings of the ranch that delighted both his parents and maid Devereaux, who had been on the Dray Ranch for 17 years by then, and showed no signs of leaving, declare that there would always be a Dray Elroy on this land, which was the way he put the highest possible compliment. In 1887, their daughter was born. They named her Clara, not for Isaac's former engagement, but for the color of the winter sky on the day she arrived, which Josephine declared was the clearest, most perfect blue she had ever seen. And Clara was a bright, fierce child from the first week who had her mother's directness and her father's deep resolve, and who at 2 years old was already following Thomas around and insisting on participating in everything he did regardless of whether she was technically capable yet. Isaac, watching his 2 children in the yard one October afternoon while Josephine stood beside him with a cup of coffee, felt something that he had no adequate words for, which was an unusual experience for a man who was generally precise about language. He said as much. Josephine looked at him with the slight smile that she had for his particular kind of honesty. "That's called contentment," she said. "Is that what it is?" he said. "It is," she said. "I know because I feel it too." He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they watched their children in the golden October light of the New Mexico territory. On the land her grandfather had broken and her father had almost lost and she had held, and that was now theirs together. The Voss affair, as it came to be called in Red Rock, had rippled outward in ways that continued for years. The Territorial Attorney General's investigation into the Consolidated Territorial Bank's practices led to the first formal regulations on predatory lending in New Mexico Territory. Passed in 1885 by the territorial legislature after lobbying from a coalition that included Samuel Greer, who had become something of a regional figure on the issue, and 3 of the other affected landowners. It was not comprehensive legislation, and it had gaps, and it would take decades more for the full architecture of protections that ordinary people needed to be built. But it was a beginning, and it was real. And it had started with a woman who refused to let her father's land be taken, and a man who stood in a town hall and said the words that needed to be said. Harlan Voss left Red Rock in 1884 under the combined pressure of the legal proceedings and the absolute social isolation that comes in a small town when everyone knows what you have done. He went to Denver and then presumably beyond, and no one in Red Rock heard from him again, which was fine by everyone who had known him. Martha Kane recovered her 60 acres in the 1885 settlement and expanded her operation with her 2 sons, who were grown by then and capable, and her ranch became one of the more productive smaller operations in the Eastern Territory. She and Josephine maintained a correspondence for years, and Martha came to the Elroy Dray Ranch every Christmas for the rest of the decade, and Thomas called her Aunt Martha, which pleased her enormously. The railroad spur was eventually built through the territory in 1886, and because Josephine held the eastern parcels and was now part of a formal landowners association that Isaac had helped organize, the routing negotiation happened on fair terms. The compensation for right-of-way access was reasonable and structured correctly, and the access road that the railroad built along the edge of the eastern ridge actually improved the ranch's ability to move cattle to the railhead, which was a significant operational improvement. Samuel Greer eventually ran for the territorial legislature in 1888 and lost narrowly, but the fact that he ran at all and came as close as he did was a reflection of the reputation he had built in the years of the Voss proceedings. He married a schoolteacher named Ida in 1886, and they had 3 children. And he and Isaac had a working friendship that included an annual chess game every New Year that neither of them ever decisively won. In 1889, New Mexico Territory began the proceedings that would eventually lead to statehood, though it would be 1912 before that was complete. The territorial period was changing, becoming something more settled and institutionalized, and the wild edge of it, the open lawlessness and the way power had operated through physical presence and force of will rather than legal structure, was slowly closing. Isaac and Josephine both felt this change. Both understood it as generally a good thing even as it closed off something they had both, in different ways, been formed by. "You miss it?" She asked him one evening in 1890, sitting on the porch, which was where they still sat every evening when the weather allowed it. He thought about what she meant and understood exactly. "The way it was when we met," he said. "Yes," she said. "The way things felt, more open. More dangerous, I suppose, but more open." He thought about this honestly. "Sometimes," he said, "I miss the scale of it, the feeling that things weren't settled yet." He paused, "but the danger wasn't romantic." What happened to you, what happened to Martha Kane, what happened to all those families that was real harm. Yes, she said. I know, I don't miss that part. I think what we miss, he said carefully, is the version of that time that was ours, not the danger. The particular quality of everything being uncertain and then becoming certain. He looked at her. Meeting you was like that. She looked at him in the warm evening light, and the familiar warmth was there between them. Still, after 7 years, the same thing it had always been, but deeper for all the time that had been added to it. Meeting you, she said, was the thing I didn't know I was waiting for. He reached over and took her hand. She laced her fingers through his. They sat on the porch of the ranch in the settling dark and listened to the sounds of the land, and neither of them needed to say anything more. In 1891, a third child was on the way. Josephine, who was 33 now, received this information from the doctor in Red Rock with the same practical calm she brought to most things, and told Isaac that evening in the kitchen with her hands flat on the table. He looked at her with attention. "You're all right about it," he said. Not worried about her feelings, he knew her feelings, but checking that she was physically well. "I'm well," she said. "A little more tired than usual, but well." 3, he said. "Apparently," she said, and the smile was there. "Thomas is going to be intolerable," he said. "He'll think it's his job to manage the situation." "He already thinks it's his job to manage every situation," she said. "He got that from you." "He got that from you," he said, without heat, and she laughed. The baby arrived in late spring of 1892, a healthy boy whom they named William, for no one in particular, because they both simply liked the name. William was from his first weeks a different kind of child from both his siblings, cheerful and loud where Thomas was quiet and Clara was fierce. He laughed easily and frequently, and had an extraordinary talent for making people around him feel at ease, which Josephine remarked on when he was barely 3 months old, and Isaac said that it must have skipped a generation. Isaac taught Thomas to ride when he was 6, and to handle basic cattle work when he was 9, and the boy took to it with the seriousness he brought to everything, asking questions that Isaac did not always have complete answers to, which was one of the finest things about him. Josephine taught Clara to read early, and the girl consumed books with an appetite that exceeded even her mother's, and was, at age 8, already declaring that she intended to become a lawyer, which was said with such absolute certainty that neither parent felt comfortable suggesting it might be complicated. William, at 4 years old, had already charmed every ranch hand, every shopkeeper in Red Rock, and several of the chickens. The ranch itself had grown. Isaac's integration of his own operation with the dray property, and the good years of grazing that followed, and the railroad access that improved the drive efficiency, had built them into one of the more solid mid-sized cattle operations in the region. They were not the largest ranch in New Mexico territory. They were not the most glamorous. They were profitable, well-managed, debt-free, and built on clear principles about how to treat land and how to treat people. And among the people in the territory who knew cattle, the Elroy dray operation was respected without reservation. Isaac never forgot what it had cost to build it, and what it would have cost if he had not stood up in that town hall. She was, in all of this, completely herself. This was the thing about her that had never changed, and that Isaac had never stopped being grateful for. She did not become someone else because she was married, or because she had children, or because the territory around her was changing. She grew and adapted, and her understanding of things deepened with time, but the core of her, that direct, intelligent, principled woman he had watched replacing shingles on a roof in the spring of 1882, was unchanged. She was still the person he came back to. She was still, always, the most interesting person in the room. On their 10th anniversary, in March of 1893, Isaac did something he had been thinking about for a year. He commissioned a painting of the ranch from a portrait artist in Santa Fe. Not a formal painting of people, but a landscape. The view from the porch looking out over the east pasture in the late afternoon light. The cottonwood trees along the creek. The ridge in the distance. The particular quality of the sky. He had described it to the artist in specific, careful detail over several exchanges of correspondence. And when the painting arrived in Red Rock and he brought it home and unwrapped it on the kitchen table, he knew immediately that the artist had gotten it right. Josephine looked at the painting for a long moment, and then she looked at him, and her eyes were bright, and she reached out and touched the edge of the frame. "It's perfect," she said. "It's exactly right. It's what I see when I think of home," he said. She turned from the painting and put her hand against his face and looked at him. 10 years, she said. 10 years, he said. "And you are still the most surprising person who ever rode up my road," she said. He covered her hand with his. "I wasn't sure you were going to come down from that roof," he said. She laughed, surprised into it. "I almost didn't," she said. "I was in the middle of a difficult section." "I'm glad you did," he said. "So am I," she said, simply, plainly, with everything she meant behind it. She pressed her forehead against his the way she had done since the beginning, and he put his arms around her, and they stood together in the kitchen of the house her grandfather had built, with the sounds of their children somewhere outside in the yard, and the painting of their land on the table, and 10 years of honest, real, difficult, joyful life between them. Outside, Thomas, who was 9 and had appointed himself supervisor of the afternoon's activities, was instructing Clara, who was 7 and not interested in being supervised, on the proper way to water the kitchen garden. William, who was nearly 2, was sitting in the dirt nearby with profound contentment, doing nothing in particular with enormous energy. Devereux, who was somewhere in his late 60s now and had been on this land longer than anyone except the land itself, came around the corner of the barn and watched the children for a moment, and shook his head in the manner of a man who finds the universe's persistence in renewal both bewildering and gratifying. The sun came down on the ranch in the late afternoon way it had always done, filling the east pasture with warm, golden light, turning the cottonwoods along the creek to something shining and temporary, the way beauty always is, and always present for exactly that reason. In the evening, Isaac sat on the porch and Josephine brought coffee and sat beside him, and Thomas came and sat on the porch steps, and Clara brought a book and sat beside her brother and read aloud from it in the way she did sometimes, unsolicited, simply because she wanted to share something she was inside. And William came and climbed into Isaac's lap and fell asleep there with the instantaneous completeness of very young children, heavy and warm and entirely trusting. Isaac held his sleeping son and looked out at the land in the failing light, and listened to his daughter read, and felt Josephine's hand find his in the space between their chairs. 11 years ago, he had not known this place existed. He had not known any of these people. He had been building something steadily with purpose, but he had not known that what he was building toward was this. He thought sometimes about the night he had ridden through the dark toward Red Rock, toward the town hall confrontation, toward the words that had needed to be said. He had been afraid, a little, not of Harlan Voss specifically, but of the weight of it, the magnitude of what would happen if it didn't work, what she would lose. He had been afraid because he already loved her, though he had not yet said it, and the stakes of what he was about to do were measured partly in what losing would mean for her, and it had felt like the most important thing he had ever done. He had been right that it was. But what he had not understood that night, riding hard through the dark, was that the most important thing was not the confrontation. The most important thing was the life that came after it. The ordinary Tuesday mornings and the fence-mending evenings and the difficult business negotiations and the children's laughter and the silence they shared that was better than most people's conversations. All of it. The whole accumulated weight and texture and reality of a life built together with someone you chose, and who chose you back with complete honesty. They watched it until it was gone. "Did you make a wish?" Clara asked, looking up from her book. Thomas considered this with his usual seriousness. "I don't think you have to wish for things when you already have what you want," he said. Josephine looked at her son with the particular expression she had for moments when her children said something that caught her completely off guard. She glanced at Isaac. He met her eyes, and in them was everything: the road he had ridden, the room he had stood in, the words he had said, and the 10 years after, and the years ahead, and all of it built on the simple, hard, absolute thing between them that had been real from the beginning and would not stop being real. "Your son," he said quietly. "Our son," she said. They sat together on the porch in the growing dark, with their land spread out before them and their children around them, and the stars coming fully out above the high desert. And the night was warm, and the house behind them was lit, and the whole of it, every part of it, was theirs.